Today is Wednesday, June 23rd, and I'd like to take time today to talk about a topic that's practical and is very important in the education of Catholic children, and it's the topic of disputations and their role in Catholic education. If you look at the About page, the About the CLEA page on the Academy website, you'll see that there's a list of quotes from priests and colleagues and parents that we share on there to give new parents some feedback to consider as they look at our program. And there's one quote on there from a former colleague of mine in which he praises me as being the most brilliant person he ever met. And it's really funny. That colleague was a Protestant theology teacher at the private school I taught at in Charlotte. He and I argued every single day. I as a Catholic, he as a Protestant. He's a great guy, and we were very close friends. And we had great debates every day between Catholicism and Protestantism. And when I was leaving the school to start the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, he asked if he could write a recommendation for me to help me as I got started. And he wrote that extremely flattering recommendation. But what's funny about it is that he referred to me as one of the most brilliant men he ever met. And if you hear that, I mean, obviously it's stupid, but if you hear that, what it should remind us of is the fact that Socrates, when he taught in the ancient world, said that the oracle at Delphi said that he was the wisest man in the world. And so it's similar, this quote from my former colleague, theology teacher, and the message of the oracle at Delphi regarding Socrates. And what's interesting about them is Socrates was not called the wisest man in the world because he had all the answers. He was called the wisest man in the world because he was the only one who, because of his sincere examination, knew and acknowledged that he didn't have the answers. And it was his ignorance, his acknowledged ignorance, that actually led him to be called the wisest man in the world. So it's kind of a funny title. And in the same way, it's funny for me to have this former colleague say that I'm the most brilliant man he'd ever met, even though he'd been through seminaries and had been surrounded with famous Protestant theologians and scholars, to call me the most brilliant man he ever met. But I think that there's something in what he was saying, and it was that unlike other people in his life and in his circles, there was something different about my ability to argue and reason that he had never experienced before. And that's true. My ability to reason with him, because of my background in classical liberal arts, gave me abilities to defeat his arguments and to propose questions that he couldn't answer. And he had never experienced that kind of reasoning in all of his academic or seminary circles. And to him, it was amazing. But it actually has nothing to do with any actual brilliance that's in me as an individual. It's just in the fact that the art of dialectical reasoning is amazing in what it allows us to do. And so I I explained to him then, and I've always explained to parents and students, that what they find unique about my ability to argue with people is not that I am some uniquely gifted individual, but that I am, like Socrates, willing to acknowledge that the popular answers need to be examined, and I'm willing to examine them even when it costs me. So people will say, oh, well, you may argue with people in an online discussion or in an article, but this isn't real life. And the reality is, it actually is real life. I've had discussions online where I've taken a position and took a strong stance that I knew when I took the stance was going to upset a lot of people. And there are times where these discussions have cost me thousands and thousands of dollars in enrollments. And people don't realize that these online discussions, especially when people are studying online, enrolling students in online courses, paying for online services, these online discussions actually are very significant in terms of consequences and costs. And to be willing to take a position that's not popular, or to be willing to examine a person or position that is very popular, doing so comes with real costs, just as Socrates learned in ancient Greece. His simple examining led him to lose his life. And as I said, I've already experienced the loss of many enrolled families, thousands and thousands of dollars, because I was not willing to just go along with the popular answers and copy and paste all the approved sayings of this or that group. And yet, if you look at the discussions, I don't believe you'll ever find an example where someone entered into an argument with me and actually refuted my arguments or provided evidence that disproved my position. I have nothing to lose in an argument. I'm seeking to know what's true. I'm not going to take anything for granted that's not justified. I'm going to ask for proof whenever I don't have it. And if there's no proof, I'm not going to grant the argument. And this is something that modern Catholics don't do. They think that they do it. They think that because their position is popular or because it's championed by some online celebrity, that therefore it's the truth. But they haven't examined it. They haven't demanded proof. And when I ask the question, or when I examine the position, I get attacked. The attacks, however, are not logical. They're not evidential in the sense that I'm not attacked with evidence. I'm not attacked with logical proofs. When I make an argument, people don't show that my argument is a fallacy or that my conclusion doesn't follow from my premises. People get angry. They project their own frustration onto me as if I'm angry. And they attack me personally by, calling me I'm divisive or uncharitable because I ask for proof. And we see that the dilemma that Socrates faced in his day is just as present in our crazy society as it was back in his, when the sophists dominated public discussion just as they do today. And many of the sophists are Catholics and Christians who work in media and online publishing. So the brilliance of the discussion is in the method itself, not in the one using that method. So I'll gladly take and share that great recommendation, as flattering as it is, but I know, and you should know, what it is that's actually praiseworthy, and you should understand that you and your children can enjoy the use of it yourselves. It's just a matter of learning and practice, which is the nature of every art. So the question is, what is this method and how can we learn it? And that's what I'd like to talk about in this walk talk. The method that needs to be learned and practiced is called the disputation. It's a certain kind of exercise by which we examine some controversial question. And there's a very clear procedure for how the discussion takes place, and they're very effective either when used privately as our own methods of meditation or examination or decision making, or by students in learning really the right way to write argumentative essays. You'll see that what modern schools try to teach students is just a lame attempt to teach what would much more effectively be learned if they were taught to dispute. But the schools can't teach disputations because if those students turn around and target their teachers with their disputation skills, it would be a nightmare for those teachers and for those schools or for parents of those students. And in my teaching, in my school teaching, when you see that one colleague saying that he'd never seen a teacher have such an impact on students and that I revolutionized the lives of young people, all that he's talking about is the fact that I taught them the method of disputation. It changed their lives, changed their view about studies, sent them into their other classes asking questions of their teachers, caused a lot of controversy in those other classes. I was not a popular faculty member because of these things, and yet students became zealous for learning because in disputations we can see why our studies are important. And I'll explain all this as we talk about it. So what this disputation is, as I said, is a method of examination, method of investigation. This is really the work of Aristotle. It's not the Socratic method. It's not the Socratic method. It's more developed than the Socratic method. For all the talk in modern circles in classical education about the Socratic method, what's funny is that they seem to ignore the reality that the Socratic method was a crude, primitive form of the disputational method or the scholastic method that would be developed later by Aristotle and employed by Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics in Catholic Church history. All of this talk about the Socratic method is kind of dopey because the Socratic method was just the beginning. The Aristotelian method, the scholastic method, is what Catholics should be talking about, not the Socratic method. I mean, here's a very simple test. Read one of the dialogues of Plato on a subject, and then read one of Aristotle's treatises on a subject. Or read the Summa Theologica on a subject and tell me which is more effective at establishing and teaching the truth. Plato's dialogues, assuming these people actually read them, are normally just used to destroy false ideas. They very rarely establish or demonstrate the true ideas. The whole difference between the Socratic method and the Aristotelian method is that Aristotle goes the next step and actually demonstrates what's true. He doesn't merely tear apart what's false. The Aristotelian method is the method of the true master, and that's why St. Thomas Aquinas calls Aristotle the philosopher. I mean, you can, I hope, understand how all of this fake classical education stuff vexes me, because it's so silly and ignorant. How can a college call itself Thomas Aquinas College and not understand the method of Thomas Aquinas? It's comical, but that's really how far we've fallen. That Catholic parents are willing to pay $35,000 a year, or at least that's the advertised tuition. Who knows what the actual costs are, or if that's even realistic. But who would pay tens of thousands of dollars to go to a college named after a scholastic philosopher and doctor of the church, when that college advertises a method that wasn't even the method employed by that scholar after whom the school is named? How could anyone fall for that kind of thing? But I try to tell people that's how silly this fake classical education movement is. Catholics are not primarily interested with the Socratic method. We're practitioners of the Scholastic or Aristotelian method. So anyway, the disputation gives us the opportunity to pursue truth in controversial matters following the method of Aristotle, a method used by the scholastics, promoted by Thomas Aquinas, and used all through schools in the Middle Ages. For example, when we hear that Martin Luther, in 1517, went down and nailed his 95 theses to the door of a church in Germany, and all the Protestants get excited about that as if it was some kind of heroic event, like some modern political action. When we actually understand what he was doing in its context, he was simply posting 95 theses, that is, controversial answers to questions that he proposed for disputation. What he was doing was totally normal. It's just like if I went down to the local school and I posted on the bulletin board 12 questions that I think we should debate. And everyone could walk up and read the questions and see what I'd like to debate, and then they could decide whether or not they'd like to participate in that debate or not. I could say, hey, on Thursday at 7:30 p.m. in conference room A, we're going to hold disputations on these topics. So we're going to cover one topic each week. If you'd like to join me for the disputation or participate in the disputation, you're welcome. Come and join us. That's all the 95 Theses were. What was significant about the 95 Theses was that the actual content of those theses directly challenged many matters of church authority. And they were posted by a prominent monk who was considered a biblical scholar. And so it became scandalous, and news of these theses was spread among all the gossips in town, and it caused all kinds of uproar. But the Catholic Church wasn't concerned about these 95 theses. None of the scholars in the church thought anything of them, and they welcomed Luther to those disputations. And they whooped him in those disputations, which is why he eventually had to run away. That's actually why Protestants embraced the scientific method, because it was their only escape from the scholastic method, which went before it, the true method of investigation. So, this method is of interest to us as Catholics, very peculiar interest to us as Catholics, because it's by this method that the truth of the Catholic faith and all of its details was established in history, and by which it's defended in the present. It's also the method by which new controversies are to be investigated, so that new Catholic answers can be formulated and then defended. The fact that you've never heard of it before, the fact that you've never seen it in action, should cause you to wonder, what the heck's going on? How can the Catholic faith be based on something that's no longer in use? And I would argue that that's the problem. So, let's get into the details. What is a disputation? As I said, it's a method of investigation when we're proposed with a question, a controversial question, the answer of which is one of two possible options. An answer in the positive and its contrary in the negative. Where can you see this? Very simply, every single article of the Summa Theologica. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them are examples of disputations. Almost like the transcript of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of theological disputations. This is how St. Thomas established the Summa Theologica. It was through the study of Aristotle, establishing himself as a master of Aristotelian philosophy, that Thomas Aquinas mastered the method of investigation and then applied it to questions of theology. The problem with modern men who call themselves Thomists and claim to have some admiration for Thomas Aquinas is that what they're usually talking about is just that they read the Summa Theologica, or that they read his ethics, or some of his philosophical treatises. But what they neglect, and what distinguishes a modern Thomist from Thomas Aquinas himself, is that they neglect to study and master the method, which is actually what's important. The method is what's actually important. And this is what John Henry Newman referred to in the quote that I very commonly share, which is, "Many think in an age like this, where books abound, that gratification of a love of reading is real study. It's not the real thing. All of this talk of great books and literature is not real classical Catholic study. The real classical Catholic study is extremely difficult. Men don't want to do it. You don't get paid for it. There's no way to turn it into a quick buck. And so no one is willing to invest the effort in mastering the real learning But this is the real learning that marks St. Thomas Aquinas. He actually mastered the art of reasoning as taught in Aristotle's Organon, and then not only mastered the art so that he could teach the art itself, but he then went and did what we should all aspire to do who study, and that is take the art and apply it to controversial questions of his own generation. We'll find in our generation men who are very eloquent in their ability to refute false teachings and answer controversial questions that were controversial 300 years ago or 1,000 years ago. But when it comes to questions of our own generation, they just babble and pass around the same gossip everyone else does. They don't have an actual method. It's one thing to learn the answers that wise men have established in the past. It's a very different thing to be the wise man who establishes the true answers in the present. And what our generation so desperately lacks is that kind of present wise man who, when a new topic arises, a new question arises, possesses the method by which he can examine that issue and demonstrate the truth, rather than just jumping into the party debates, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, and pick a side. That's what plagues modern Catholic thinking, is that it's become shallow and political, and the people who claim to be Thomists and scholars and theologians are really just readers who know answers from dead men's writings, but can't produce the answers themselves to new questions. The disputation is the method by which we learn to do this. Now, as for the method itself, as I said, we start with a controversial question, and the question has two possible answers: a positive answer and its contrary, a negative answer. So, for example, just to take a simple question off the top of my head, we could ask a question like, whether man is mortal. There's only two possible answers to this question. Yes, man is mortal, or no, man is not mortal. Now, any question that admits more than this kind of simple yes or no answer is not appropriate for disputation, but usually needs to be analyzed or broken down into simpler questions and then disputed one by one, with the answers to those simpler questions being then synthesized or brought together to produce the final answer to the original complex question. So not any question is appropriate for disputation, and one of the chief problems in modern dialogue is that there are many questions that are disputed in political or religious circles that aren't appropriate for disputation. And that's why there's never any solution. And the two ignorant sides just go on back and forth pretending that they're smart, when if there was one smart person among them, he would raise his hand and say, wait a minute, this question is not appropriate for disputation. Let's break it down into simpler questions. But instead they just pretend that they're smart and argue back and forth endlessly and fruitlessly according to their party preferences. So we have to make sure that the question is actually an appropriate question for disputation. It can only admit one answer or its contrary. That's the first issue. So if we look through all of the questions, all of the articles in the Summa Theologica, we'll see that the first challenge St. Thomas had was to find questions that were appropriate for disputation. And that's a skill and an achievement in St. Thomas's work that we take for granted when we don't understand the real nature of the work that he completed. So we have to start with a true question that's worthy or appropriate for disputation. Now, one person will offer to respond to the question, to answer the question. He'll pick a side, one of the two possible answer choices, and his answer is his thesis. That's what a thesis is. A thesis is one's answer to a controversial question. So when we talk about a thesis paper, and most people in modern circles have no idea what we're talking about, one of the reasons why people don't know what we're talking about is because the questions proposed by teachers for the assignments aren't even appropriate for these essays, which is why the students can never figure out how to answer them, and why they have to be graded subjectively by the teachers. But all a thesis essay or a thesis paper is an essay where one presents his response to a controversial question. And there's an appropriate format or method for doing this. Now, this is not easy. And this is where the Aristotelian method differs from the Socratic method. In the Socratic method, Socrates pretended to be ignorant. He knew the answer. He knew the truth. But he used the method as a way of leading someone else to persuasion by their own reasoning. That's the point of the Socratic method. But as I said, the Socratic method, all that it really does is shows the impossibility of the other person's false ideas. It won't demonstrate the truth of Socrates' own position. So Socrates would pretend to be ignorant. He would pretend as if he was sincerely asking these questions for the first time, and then he would simply follow the answers of the respondent, the person who answered his questions, and they would just kind of go on a journey together. And Plato's dialogues are ridiculously long, sometimes pointlessly long, but they would eventually come to some point of crisis or contradiction, which was Socrates' goal. To come to a point where the respondent's answers led to a contradiction that proved that something in that train had to be false. And that would be Socrates' victory once they reached that point. To respond to a disputation question is different, because the person who's responding doesn't simply answer yes or no questions, as in the Socratic method, but he has to actually attempt to formulate a demonstrative answer to the question. He picks a side of the question that he believes is true, and then he seeks to provide a demonstrative response. That's why if you look at the Summa Theologica and see what St. Thomas does, you'll see the question proposed in the article. And then you'll see a couple objections listed, and we'll get to them in a minute. But then you'll see where he writes, I respond, or I reply. And there we see a summary of his response to the controversial question. It's his thesis, his answer to the question, positively demonstrated. So he provides an answer, and he provides proof that that answer is positively true. And that's what's different about the Scholastic method or the Aristotelian method. We don't simply take a tour of someone's yes or no answers to a question and see where it leads us. The first response is intended to be thorough and complete. It's intended to be demonstrative. The respondent makes his best effort to answer the question and demonstrate. And by demonstrate, I mean prove without doubt that his answer is the true answer. That's the challenge of the respondent. It's the purpose of an essay, is to create that first response. Now, in most cases, if the respondent actually does know the true answer and is able to provide the proof for that answer, the investigation is over because it will have been demonstrated to be true. And so in the Scholastic Method, the question can be answered and demonstrated and the investigation finished in one shot if the response is true and demonstrative. But once the original response is given, that response is then submitted to everyone who's participating in the disputation. They're allowed to review it, and they're allowed to judge whether or not there's any point in that response that is either false, let's say an assertion that's made that no evidence has been provided for, but it's taken for granted. Someone can raise an objection to that assertion and say, this argument here is based on the assumption that this assertion is true, and yet no evidence has been provided. Therefore, I do not grant this assumption, and therefore that argument which is based on this assertion is therefore not demonstrative. And so then the respondent would need to provide evidence that proved that assertion was in fact true. So the truth of an assertion could be objected to and proof required. The other option that the hearers or the audience had was to find a flaw in the reasoning that was used in any logical arguments that were made to prove the respondent's thesis. Now, the problem with this is that finding the flaws with a logical argument assumed that both the respondent and those in the audience, those disputing with him, it assumed that they knew Aristotle's art of reasoning and the syllogism and could use the knowledge of that art to examine a logical art. Well, first of all, they could use that art to assemble a syllogism and use that syllogism in an argument to prove a point. But then those who heard the argument or read the argument could analyze and see whether or not the respondent actually did follow the rules that Aristotle establishes on the doctrine of a syllogism. So the disputation required that all those who participated already knew and understood the art of reasoning as taught by Aristotle and can then use it both in formulating their responses and in criticizing or analyzing the responses that were made. So it assumes a certain level of study and a shared understanding of the principles of the syllogism and the art of reasoning. And this was what was lacking in Socrates' day. The doctrine of the syllogism was not yet established. Philosophers had been working towards it, and they were getting close. They had some of the basic ideas of how reasoning actually works and why conclusions follow from premises. Understanding exactly what that process is was still not scientifically understood by the Socratic philosophers or even by Plato, but that was the work and achievement of Aristotle, teaching and establishing and teaching the science of reasoning, which we learn in the organon, in classical reasoning. So, in a disputation, the respondent has to know the art of reasoning. He has to know how to formulate a true syllogism. And he has to use the syllogism, wherever possible, to demonstrate the truth of his answers. Those hearing, as I said, would read the response or hear the response, and they would have the opportunity then to find fault with it, to object to it. And as I said, there were two basic forms or sources of objection. One was just the truth or falsehood or the evidence of assertions that are made, and the other was an actual flaw in the logic itself used to form a conclusion, to prove a point. So the responses had to meet certain criteria, but the objections also had to follow certain criteria. And all of those who participated had to know these things, at least in a general way, where they could put them to use to dispute a topic. As I said, if the original response was effective, there might be no objections. And the disputation might just end with the original response. But the more expert and discerning the audience or the readers are, the more likely it is that some fault can be found with the response. And this is where objections are raised. And that's why in the Summa Theologica, you'll see St. Thomas's reply, which is his response to the question, and then you'll see a number of objections that are raised. And those objections then are presented not as new responses. This is one of the problems with modern debate or modern discussion, is that often people just want to hear themselves, and instead of responding to the original response with an objection, they're just eager to be the respondent themselves and start the whole thing from scratch. You'll see this, for example, in a forum discussion or a social media discussion. Let's say it's on my Facebook page and I'll write a response to some controversial question. You'll see a commenter who's just eager to publish his ideas to my audience, who instead of responding to my actual post, just writes his own. That's just talking to hear yourself. That's not disputation. And so what I'll ask is, do you have an objection to an assertion that I've made or to an argument that I've made that you can show to be either false as regards a statement or invalid as regards a conclusion that's drawn through an argument? Now, when we're challenging an assertion, it's really not fair for the respondent to tell his audience that they can go and fact check what he says. This is why in any writing class, students will be taught that when you make a statement, when you make an assertion in writing, you should provide the proof. And in fact, as Christians, our lives would radically change, and many things that we think and say and do would radically change if we held ourselves accountable to prove any assertion that came out of our mouths. If you can't prove it, how can you assert it? That's what it means to be a person who's concerned about truth, is that you would never think, you would never admit any assertion without evidence. And yet we find that whole arguments, whole positions are asserted by Christians today for which they have not one shred of evidence. A perfect example of this is this fake classical education movement. Not a shred of evidence. And yet people walk around asserting things all over the place. That would never be allowed in a disputation. And when these people are questioned, they get offended because they want to be able to assert whatever benefits their business with no examination. So in the disputation, the first response is made, and as I said, this is challenging because the person who responds needs to try and formulate a demonstrative response to the question. And then the audience gets a chance to hear or read the response, think about it, reflect on it, not just respond stupidly, at the moment, right on, off the top of their head or shoot from the hip. They have a chance to go read the response, think about it, and formulate a serious objection to some assertion or argument that's been made based on the rules of reasoning. Once an objection is made, and it's a legitimate objection, it follows the understood criteria for a true objection. It's not just an annoying contradiction made by someone else that the respondent then has to answer. The respondent has no obligation to just answer someone else's opinion. But if someone raises a legitimate objection, then the respondent has to refute that objection. And so the original response is challenged, and the respondent has to refute the objection. And this is what we see St. Thomas do in the Summa. So St. Thomas will respond to the question. He'll then acknowledge an objection, state the objection that's made against him, and then further down in each article, he'll respond to each of the objections. He'll refute each objection. So there's a positive response, and then there's a successful refutation of each objection. And that what we see there in the Summa Theologica is the method of disputation simply summarized for publication. That's not how the disputation would actually work in practice, because the objections would not come first. The response comes first, then an objection is made one by one and responded to with a refutation. This scholastic method, or Aristotelian method, allows us to actually make progress quickly, as opposed to the Socratic method. It allows us to establish positive, systematic doctrine or science on a subject, because Aristotle's doctrine of the syllogism provides us with the instrument that we can use to formulate positive, demonstrative truth, which is what the Socratic method cannot do. So for a quick review, how a disputation would work. Let me tell you what I used to do in my classes with my students, which is how I taught them and used this as a method, not of instruction for me to use with them, but for them to use in their own studying. Because my concern was to teach them the method, not to teach them the answers. What I would do is I would assign every student the opportunity to prepare a response to a controversial question. They would have time to research, time to prepare, basically an essay format, a response to some controversial question. They were allowed to choose the question. They simply had to have it approved to make sure that it was an appropriate question for a disputation, that there could only be 2 possible answer choices. Once I approved their question, they then had a certain number of weeks or whatever to work on it, and they had a scheduled day when they would present their response to the class. And they would simply read their response, whether they presented it as a speech and had memorized it or they just read it to the class. I would also require them to provide each student with a copy of it. So every student would have a copy of the response and would get to listen to the student give the response. Once the response was finished, I would then ask the students if they had any objections that they'd like to make. And usually there would be 1 or 2 objections immediately. Some of the sharper kids in the class would just quickly pick up on an assertion that was made with no evidence or on an argument that didn't appear to be valid. And so there'd be an objection. The student would present the objection, and the respondent would then have the opportunity to refute it. If the respondent could not immediately refute the objection, he then was given time to go home and, for homework, refute the objection. If he could not refute the objection, but the objection actually destroyed his response, then he failed the assignment. And he had to pick a new question and write a new response. And every student had until the end of the semester to successfully complete a disputation. And I had students who were panicking the last days of the semester. And you can imagine the stress in a student who knew that this was his last shot to win and respond demonstratively before the end of the semester, and that he would have an F on this weighty assignment because he failed to demonstrate an answer to a controversial question. And so it was very competitive, very high stakes, and the kids loved it. And this is how my upper school, they were called debate classes because that's the modern term, but what I referred to them as was disputation classes. And that's how these classes were conducted. So every day, once we got into the semester and I had taught them the method, given them an overview of the art of reasoning and how assertions need to be supported with evidence, we would start the disputations, and we'd have them every day in class. We'd have another disputation presented. These became so popular in the school that I taught in that I would have kids coming from their study hall periods because they had a free class and asking if they could sit in on the disputations. I had seniors with senior privileges that allowed them to go home early. Instead of going home, come to my last period disputation classes to sit in and listen to the freshmen and juniors present their disputation responses. So when my colleagues and students talk about how my teaching revolutionized the lives of young people or changed their lives or taught them how to think or made me appear brilliant, what they're really talking about is simply the Scholastic Method. It's this method of disputation. Because when they experienced it, when they participated in it, it just blew their minds. It made them love studies. It made them see how every subject is important, because the kids would take up topics that were of interest to them personally. So, for example, an athlete in the school would take up the question of whether pro athletes should be allowed to use steroids or performance-enhancing drugs. He would take up a question like that, and he might be an athlete who is good with history or knows a lot about current events. Maybe he knows some of the science behind sports supplements and things like that. But there could be a kid in that class who is an honors level chemistry student who can refute something that he says about chemistry. And so all of a sudden, the students realize that I can't win a sports debate because I don't know chemistry. Or I can't win a political debate because somebody raised a question about economics and I didn't know what they were talking about. And so I have to know economics in order to argue about politics. Or I can't prove my position in religion because someone raised a question about history and I didn't even know what they were. So the students, when they start to engage in these disputations, they realize that you cannot be weak in any area of study if you're going to speak persuasively and demonstratively in this method of disputation. The nerdy kid who gets knocked down the stairs and pushed into his locker in the hallway, all of a sudden pulls out these weapons in disputation that make him the champion of the disputation. The cool girl who takes up an argument on some moral topic but is immoral herself has the whole class laughing at her ridiculous response when she tries to make a serious moral argument in light of her own personal life. How ridiculous the cool girl looks trying to talk about morality. And so all of these different dynamics begin to open up in these classes where students enter into these disputations. And you see that in order to be demonstrative and persuasive, you have to be a perfect man or a perfect woman. And this leads to discussions about the rhetorical principle of ethos and its importance in persuasion. That you can't live one way and argue another way. And so the disputation not only sharpens the children intellectually, not only inspires them to appreciate all subjects of learning and makes them generally interested in studies, but it also shows them that you're going to get laughed out of a room if you try and argue a position that your personal behavior contradicts. And we see this all throughout modern society. It's one of the reasons why Christian rhetoric is so ineffective and weak. Because the Christians, everyone knows that Christian tradition includes people like St. Francis, Mother Teresa, John the Baptist, Jesus himself. And they look at this modern Christian, overweight, worried about what time lunch is, divorced twice, and they hear him trying to make some serious argument about some other moral issue that doesn't directly affect him in any way, but he's arguing as if he has some deep-seated concern for Christian morality when his physical body and known personal life prove him to have no actual sincere interest in the topic that he pretends to be pleading for. And he's simply dismissed in the minds of his audience. And this is the importance of ethos. And so this segues, as it did for my students, into the study of rhetoric, the art of rhetoric, where we learn that there are three persuasive appeals. There is the appeal of logos, or the actual proof of arguments, which assumes that we know Aristotle's art of reasoning. The appeal of ethos, or the personal character and experience of the speaker, where trust comes from. And then thirdly, pathos, which is the emotional appeal, the ability of a speaker to affect the emotion of the hearer, which again where there's hypocrisy or bad example, emotional appeals have no chance. It's also worth noting that the whole foundation of the Christian faith is based on the ethos of God Himself. We believe in divine revelation, not because of logos or logical arguments that are given to us, not because of pathos or mere emotional appeals, but we believe in the truth of sacred scripture and the teaching of the Catholic Church because of the character of the source of that information. And so the whole idea of faith is related to ethos. And that's true not only in divine things, but it's true also in disputations. If an audience knows that the speaker is sincere, that the speaker has experience in different areas, has suffered things or done things or knows things because he's participated in them, they're willing to give the speaker the benefit of the doubt. Not that they necessarily should, but they will be willing to give a speaker the benefit of the doubt because of his character, who he is, what he's done, and so on. So the disputation segues by the student's experiences into the need and desire to study and learn the art of rhetoric. And that's why Aristotle, in the opening chapter of his Art of Rhetoric, says that rhetoric is counterpart to dialectic. These logical and rhetorical sciences, they work together. Reasoning, he's speaking there of dialectical reasoning. Dialectical reasoning leads us to an understanding of the art of rhetoric, and the art of rhetoric then feeds back into our understanding of dialectical reasoning. And so these sciences, once we engage in them in the right way, not as fake classical schools and programs do, but according to true Catholic scholastic disputations, the students will be led naturally into the study of rhetoric. They'll be sent back to the study of the art of reasoning because their experience will help them to understand things that they couldn't possibly understand when they had tried to read them without experience. And that's how the cyclical study of classical studies works, which I always talk about. We continue learning, we practice. Our practice helps us to understand the texts that we study, and we go back to those texts. We read them with experience that helps us to understand them more fully, which allows us to go back into our experience with greater understanding, which gains for us new and better experience, which allows us to go back to the sources and understand the text more. And that cycle of learning and practice produces what we call an art in us. If you give me a controversial topic, I can provide you with a response in seconds because of my experience. And students will learn to do that over time as well. If I was asked to write an essay, like my children are in college and they'll write to me and ask me for help because they have to write an essay, I could put an essay together in 30 seconds because I simply know how to approach the question, establish a thesis, come up with 2 or 3 arguments or proofs for it, and that's all that any college teacher will ever be interested in. They're not going to actually seek out any proof. It's just artificial classroom activity. But the real disputation, there's no way out of it except by real demonstration, by real study, by real mastery, by real experience. And so the disputation, I would argue, the exercise of disputation is really the foundation, the heart of classical education, of real classical education, especially of Catholic classical education. One of the most ridiculous things about Catholics who talk about classical education and don't even use Catholic study materials is that they have no ability to discern that the Protestants rejected the Scholastic Method and abandoned it And so you'll have people using logic textbooks that were written by Protestants. The cluelessness in the Catholic homeschooling community, as if your textbooks don't need to really be Catholic. They can just, you can just go grab a math book or a science book or a reasoning book from some Protestant publisher because it looks cool or because it's popular in homeschool circles, is so ignorant. I hope naive. But we can't do that. We have to learn the true scholastic method. We have to learn to use the disputation, and it has to become a central activity in the daily lives, the studies of our older students and of us as adults. In our discussions as adults, we should be using disputations. We should be writing back and forth to each other using disputations, objecting to our responses to questions, refuting objections, and using that to formulate truth in new controversies, new questions. That's what we should be doing, and we don't see Christians doing this. Like I said, we see the lazy, ignorant party spirit, just arguing back and forth between two political parties, liberals, conservatives, Trump, Biden, Democrat, Republican, pro-life, pro-choice. Every modern issue, capitalism, socialism, breaks down into some lazy, ignorant, democratic party dispute because there's no real reasoning. And the truth is found in neither of the two parties. But no one knows how to find an answer. The answer is in the disputation. So, we can talk about these things, and that's all well and good, but what are we actually going to do with them? What can we actually do with this? Well, first of all, there's not going to be a course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy on disputations because disputation is a method that's learned in reasoning, and it's a method that applies in every subject, in all studies. So we're not going to have a class where students write disputations. What I recommend is if students would like to write disputations, or if adults would like to write disputations, I ask that you study Aristotle's reasoning, or at least watch my videos on Aristotle's reasoning as I go through it this year. Learn the method of disputation, and then begin challenging yourself to answer controversial questions with responses and submit them to others for review. You can do this by sending them to me, and I can create a space for them on the Academy website where students or adults could post responses to controversial questions and then take objections and work out answers. If there's a lot of interest, which I doubt there will be, but if there happened to be a lot of interest, we could develop something more substantial and make it a little more serious, which would be wonderful, of course, and would solve a million problems in Catholic education. But as I said, I don't believe modern Christians want to seek truth in this way, which is why they don't do it to some degree naturally, because there's lots of other things they're interested in. But if, by the grace of God, a generation of Catholics decided that they wanted to stop playing the news media game, following the YouTube celebrities that just stir up party spirit and this ignorant, false dilemma disputing, and wanted to really address individual questions using disputations in a truly Catholic method of reasoning, we could do so. So I hope that's helpful. I hope it's helpful for you to understanding what the disputation is. If you're a homeschooling parent, you can learn to use disputations as a way to just communicate in your own family. You can have fun sitting around as a family, ask a controversial question and see if any of the kids would like to respond, and then raise objections and allow that to guide some discussions. I used to give my students free run. If any topic was open, they could take topics where they were fighting with their parents about whether or not premarital sex was okay. You want to make that you want to do a disputation on whether premarital sex is okay? You're welcome to do so. And I'd have students make their best attempt to make an argument and lose. And see that it's not just mom and dad. Your arguments are just not good. And your position is false. Or I'd have a student argue why marijuana should be legalized because he smokes marijuana and he thinks it's stupid that it's illegal. Go ahead, go for it. You're going to lose, but you can give it a try. And that's one of the benefits of disputation. It allows us to show that we're all accountable to higher standards than our own authority or opinion, but that there are true authorities and true standards which all of our ideas are subject to, and we're all willing to be examined. We're all willing to subject ourselves to examination and not just force our opinions by emotional appeals or pressure or threats to pull our money out of things and so on, which is all just various forms of violence, really. So, I hope that's helpful. If you're a school teacher and you're listening to this, and you'd like to learn to use the disputation as an activity in your classes, get in touch with me and I'll try to help you put this into a more organized format that you can actually use in class as an activity. Maybe replace or at least provide some real direction for your desire to have your students write and do essay work, but actually have a more interesting purpose for it and get them out of the boring modern school writing, which everyone knows doesn't work. So if you're a school teacher, get in touch. I'll help you put lesson plans together to use disputations in your class. If you're a homeschooling parent, maybe I'll put an article. You can listen to this talk, obviously, and start to use it with your children, but I'll put a more formal article together where I provide instructions and steps. I've already done that in the past. I just have to find it. And you can begin having your children write responses. And if they do, you can send them on to me, and I'll be the objector or the devil's advocate, as it were, and raise objections that your children can then respond to, and we'll put them to work. So I hope that's helpful. That's an overview of the Scholastic Method, not to be confused with the inferior and obsolete Socratic Method, which was taught by Aristotle and perfected and employed by St. Thomas Aquinas, which became the method of theological investigation of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. I hope that's helpful. Please take some time to subscribe to this channel if you like these talks. Please comment if you have any thoughts or questions. Share the talks with others whom you think might be interested. All of this engagement and feedback tells YouTube that our videos are interesting to people, and that gets more attention for them. So that's really helpful, not only for me in promoting the message, but just for classical Catholic education in general, for having videos pop up on people's video feeds that might interest them and introduce them to ideas that they've never heard before. So please do comment, subscribe, share. Those actions are really helpful. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.